Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we are going over all the new Tarkir Dragonstorm spoilers from today, new combos, new synergies, mostly focusing on standard. We got a ton of new cards today, so let's jump into it. The first one is United Battlefront, which was actually spoiled yesterday, but definitely a new one since the last spoiler video I did. It is a 4-mana sorcery. Look at the top 7 cards of your library. Put up to 2 non-creature, non-land permanent cards may value 3 or less from among them onto the battlefield, with the rest of them bottom of your library in random order. So this card is pretty powerful. For 4 mana, you can potentially get 6 mana value worth of cards. Some card selection, and you put them directly on the battlefield. Now you definitely have to build your deck around this because you can't have any creature cards basically that you could hit with this. And you probably don't want too many creatures or even just non like permanent cards in your deck for this to be able to hit 2 things consistently, but there are specific decks this could be very powerful in. This works well with a Solemnity 9 lives in Pioneer, that sort of 2-card combo that makes it so you can't like take any damage. You could find either piece of that and is in the same colors as that. So if you play Pioneer, I think that could definitely be a good piece for that combo. In Standard, we've got sort of Caretaker's Talent, Urbrass Forge, which is kind of nice, and that seems to play already in a deck. And so maybe this is a way to kind of find that 2-card combo or multiple Caretaker's Talents, multiple Urbrass Forges, maybe even in an oil counter kind of deck with the Filigree Silex. Also, the Simulacrum Synthesizer, there's like a blue-white artifact deck this could be quite powerful in, because it can find artifacts, it can find enchantments, and those are in Planeswalkers as well. Those are the main things it can find, but there are some powerful artifacts and a synthesizer. If you found 2 synthesizers, I think you'd get 2 golems right away, and then any other artifacts you play would just give you tons of tokens that way. So I think this card is quite powerful. It definitely can find some key pieces to certain decks, but you really do have to build around it. But if you do, I think it's definitely worth it. So I wouldn't be surprised if this sees some play in Standard or Pioneer. Okay, next up we've got the Dracogenesis, which is 6 mana, basically an Omniscience for dragons. Says you can cast dragon spells without paying the mana cost. It's a little different than Omniscience. I was noticing the wording. It says you can pay without paying their mana costs. Omniscience says you can only cast them from your hand without paying a mana cost. I'm not sure if that really matters that much. If there's certain dragons that you can cast from other zones, from like exile or your graveyard, then that could matter. But basically, you're getting an Omniscience for dragons only, which I was like, well, if you really need that, like we already have Omniscience. There's some distinct differences. Obviously, this costs 8 mana. Omniscience costs 10 mana, so if you're hard casting it, this is easier to hard cast. If you're ramping and you're like accelerating, or you have casting rituals into this, maybe. I was also thinking like Squirming Emergence. It does count the permanent the graveyard with a mana value less than equal to the number of permanent cards. So it is a little easier to Squirming Emergence this back if you're trying to cheat it into play that way. Um, so that is something. It also is red if you're just playing like Commander in a red deck and you can't play Omniscience. So certainly could be pretty sweet in Commander, I can imagine. But in Standard, like the only card I can think that was quite good with this is the Hoarding Broodlord, because that can search for another dragon, and I believe you can just cast that for free. That whichever another dragon. So if you have 4 of those in your deck, you could search all those out and play them, and then play some other big dragon finisher. After that, maybe they'll give us a dragon that gives like all dragons haste. I don't think they have that in Standard right now, but maybe that will be a dragon that we are able to get and to kind of complete that sort of combo win with that these 2 cards. But I don't know. Let me know in the comments below if there's any other uses for this card. It does seem kind of niche, and it's kind of like, well, if you're going to play Omniscience, you might as well just play Omniscience. But maybe there's some other uses for this that I'm not quite thinking about. Definitely an interesting card nonetheless, and pretty fun for sure. Okay, next up we've got Ugin. Speaking of dragon planeswalkers here, 7 mana, colorless for 7 loyalty. This is when he casts his spell, exile up to 1 target permanent that's 1 or more colors. So that will often remove, your opponent's best permanent just by casting this. And then when you cast a colorless spell, exile 1 target permanent that's 1 or more colors. Pretty good. So already, like if they just printed this 7 mana with those two abilities, that might see some play, but it is a Planeswalker and it has more abilities. So 0 to add 3 additional mana, so the 3 mana could be useful just to cast another colorless spell right away to get that trigger again, right? Or, I mean, you could play like Ornithopters and things that cost 0 and kind of get that, but +2 to gain 3 life and draw a card, so not bad. Goes up to 9 loyalty, and then -11. Search your library for any number of colorless non-land cards, exile them, then shuffle. Until end of turn, you can cast those cards without paying their mana cost. So it kind of just wins you the game if you have enough colorless cards. I believe you can search up other copies of Ugin itself and then kind of cast another copy of Ugin, right? Because it's a colorless non-land card. So that's kind of sweet. Or you can just kind of keep chaining Ugins together. Where does he play? I think potentially in Modern with the Urzatron lands. You can cast this on turn 3, perhaps pretty consistently, and it certainly is a very powerful payoff, I think. Um, Doubling Season is kind of sweet with this and standard. If you play this and then you have Doubling Season, you play this, you can ultimate it right away. And again, kind of search for more copies of Ugin if you want, or just any other colorless spells in exile. Like all the cards your opponent has in play probably is going to win you the game, most likely. So it seems pretty good in that regard. You can also like cast like Emrakul off the ultimate for free, maybe, or maybe you're just kind of like using it for value and you're playing a bunch of like cheap cantrips that are colorless, like the Guidelight Matrix. There's quite a few in standard that are 2 mana that just like draw you a card. So potentially you could just play this, use the 0 to add mana, play a Guidelight Matrix or whatever, and then exile another thing of your opponent's, and then just kind of keep going through your deck with these kind of cantrippy colorless spells that exile stuff, and just exile your opponent's board pretty quickly with that way. This card seems powerful to me, and definitely has some potential to see play. I think maybe in Modern and Urzatron is maybe the best spot for it, but um, it could be some play in Standard. We'll see. Maybe they'll give us some easier ways to cast colorless things. You could again Squirmy Emergences back into play too. There's ways to cheat it into play, but then you kind of have to build around that, and it doesn't necessarily win the game if you're not playing a bunch of other colorless spells. So I'm not sure, but let me know in the comments below what you think about it. It seems pretty sweet. I wouldn't be surprised to see some play in some format. Okay, next up we've got the Voice of Victory, which is a 2-mana 1/3 with Mobilize 2. So it says whenever this creature attacks, create 2 tapped and attacking 1/1 red warrior creature tokens, sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step, and your opponents can't cast spells during your turn. So that's pretty good. So they can't like remove your creature. Like if you just play this on 2, say they're holding up removal, they can't cast their removal. So they'd have to go to their turn to cast it. So that's pretty good. It can also kind of like help you like combo off on your turn, so your opponent can't like cast counter spells to interrupt your combos, things like that. So definitely something to kind of keep an eye on. This card seems pretty powerful, but kind of taking advantage of this token ability here. Mobilize 2 seems pretty good too. I mean, just by itself, it attacks for 3, which is kind of like a Watch Wolf, basically stats. But it creates 2 tokens, which is interesting, and then you sacrifice them. So it can trigger a bunch of stuff here, like War Leader's Call would trigger 2 creatures coming into play. This would buff all of them. That would be an attack for like 8 essentially, because it itself would attack for 2. Each of the tokens would be 2, and then 2 pings with War Leader's Call. That's a really nice curve. Maybe even in like Vengeful Blood Witch, that because you're sacrificing the tokens at your end step, that would trigger that twice, and then you drain your opponent, or just you sacrifice them to like Bart and put more counters on Bart. This card seems like it has a lot of different uses to me. I mean, you do have to make sure your opponent doesn't have blockers, right? Because a 1/3 doesn't attack all that well, but I think this card's quite powerful and has a lot of value built into it for just 2 mana. And I wouldn't be surprised if this does see some standard play in some sort of shell, either an aristocrat shell or a token shell. I could kind of see it going either way there. But yeah, definitely let me know in the comments below what you think about the Voice of Victory. Seems pretty sweet to me. Okay, next up we've got I don't know how to pronounce this. The Heart of the Storm. It is a 4 mana red, white, and black 4/5 flying dragon, so decent stats already. And if a creature you control that enters this turn would deal damage. It deals twice that much damage instead. So essentially what it's saying is, like, if a creature has haste, it definitely works with this. Um, Again, Urabrask Forge is pretty sweet with this because the token comes into play, it has haste, it would double the damage of every Urabrask Forge token. If you give this itself haste, with, say, the Carnelian Orb, that's a card to kind of keep an eye on with all these dragons. Like, how good would this dragon be if it had haste? It is in, red as well. Or Cunning Coyote could give it haste, and then attack right away for 10 damage in the air. So that would be pretty good. And then, well, the Coyote itself would actually deal double damage too. That'd be attack for 14, which is pretty sweet. But yeah, this card seems powerful to me. You kind of have to build around it in the sense you want haste creatures, or if there's creatures that come into play to, like, deal damage to your opponent, like the Pyromancer, things like that. Could be interesting with this to double that damage. But I think most powerful thing you can do with it is give it itself haste. So definitely an interesting one, and one to kind of keep an eye on as we're evaluating the whole dragon theme going on here. So let's go to the next one, Sidisi, Regent of the Mire, which is a new Sidisi, a 2-mana 1/3. It's a legendary zombie snake warlock. So zombie can be a relevant creature type. Talk about that. There's another zombie card later that could be, I think, a little better. But sacrifice a creature you control with mana value X other than it, and then return target creature card with mana value X +1 from your graveyard to the battlefield. Activate only as a sorcerer. So note that it has to be exactly X +1. It can't be like X or less or exactly X. So it's kind of like a birthing pod effect here. But it is very specific into kind of how you're going to build your deck. It does seem a little challenging to set up, in my opinion. Like, you'd need to have a creature in play that has a mana value and a creature in your graveyard that has the mana value that's exactly one greater. But there are kind of ways to cheat on this, like with Birthing Pod style effects. You can, if you sacrifice something that costs 6, for example, the Gravestalker, you could cast that for cheap if you have a bunch of creatures in your yard. An example, if Atraxa itself was in your yard, then you could sacrifice it and bring Atraxa back, right? So that would be pretty good. But I don't know. Like, this card just seems a little bit more challenging to set up. You could just run it as sort of a value engine if you're having like a curve of creatures, just like a 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop kind of deck. And then, if your 3-drop dies, you can sacrifice your 2-drop to get back your 3-drop. Something like that could be interesting. I don't know. Let me know in the comments below. Maybe there's some infinite loop that I'm missing with this, or something interesting like that. But I couldn't really think of any great uses for this besides maybe cheating on mana costs kind of thing with the Gravestalker, for example. So definitely an interesting card, something maybe I'll think about a little bit more. But yeah, those are my thoughts on Sidisi. Okay, next up we've got the Marang River Regent. This card seems pretty cool. So it's got this new mechanic, the Omen mechanic, which on the left side of this card, it's 4 mana to draw 3 cards and discard a card. So that's sort of a spell that you can cast, and then you shuffle it back into your library. So it's not like an adventure; you don't get to cast both halves. It's more like a split card, basically. But it does shuffle back in, so you could draw it again later, which is kind of cool because later in the game you'd probably want to cast the right half of it, which is, I guess, this huge dragon. It's a 6-mana 6/7 flying. And when it enters, return up to 2 other target non-land permanents to their owner's hand. So interesting, and quite the tempo play. Pretty decent, I would say. You can bounce 2 of your opponent's best permanents, and you get a 6/7 flying. So not bad. Something to notice too with like all these dragons. We still have Rivaz, which ramps very well into 6-mana dragons because it itself can add an additional 2, and then it can also cast dragons from your graveyard. So that card definitely goes up in stock for more playable dragons. This card seems decent to me. It also is quite good with clone effects because I was thinking specifically the Mirror Room is quite sweet. If you had this out, you play the Mirror Room and you copy it, right? Then you get a token copy of it, and then that token copy could bounce the Mirror Room itself because it returns 2 other target non-land permanents. It doesn't say of your opponents. You could bounce the Mirror Room itself, bounce something of your opponents, and then play the Mirror Room again, right? And then get another copy of it, bounce something else, bounce the Mirror Room. You can basically go infinite depending on how much mana you have. But you have to pay 3 mana every time. But you're essentially just paying 3 mana for uh, this card over and over again, and you get an additional bounce of something of your opponent's or something of your own if you want to. So that seems kind of cool. Definitely a lot of value in that. I don't know if that's quite good enough, but just something interesting I was thinking about you could do with this card. There's probably some other interesting uses here. I mean, I feel like the left half of this card is not particularly great. You probably just wouldn't pay 4 mana just to draw 3 and discard a card, but the right half seems quite interesting to me. And the fact that they're mushed together is kind of cool too. So definitely interesting one and one to keep an eye on. Okay, next up we've got the Qarsi Revenant, 3 mana for 3/3, flying, death touch, lifelink. So vampire, nighthawk, eat your heart out. This card is just I think a strict upgrade from that card, I believe. There was a 2/3 that had those abilities, and it has another ability which is renew. 3 mana to exile this card from your graveyard, put a flying counter, a death touch counter, and a lifelink counter on target creature. Activate only as a sorcery. So this card seems pretty sweet. A lot of value built into this card. I mean, just as a 3/3 flying death touch lifelink is decent. Vampire Nighthawk doesn't see any play in standard anymore. But it is a vampire, and there are some vampire synergies here with like the Classja Highborn. So that could be interesting if you're kind of trying to play a vampire deck. Could be fine. But I think really you want to take advantage of like its graveyard ability and maybe like in a self mill deck or like Souls of the Lost kind of strategy, like that green black deck. I was thinking like what creature would want the flying death touch and lifelink counter, but Souls of the Lost seems pretty sweet. Give that flying and lifelink. Death touch probably doesn't need it that much because it's usually huge, but that card having flying and lifelink would be a huge game swing potentially because some of the problem with it is it's just a big body, and this could essentially attack uh, for lifelink and in the air for evasion. So that's kind of my thoughts with this card. Let me know if there's any other interesting synergies here, but seems like a pretty decent value card to me. Okay, next up we've got Kotis, the Fangkeeper. This is 4 mana for a 2/1 legendary zombie warrior. So another zombie here. It's indestructible. It's kind of sweet. Although there is quite a few like exile and like bounce effects and standards. So like indestructible isn't what it used to be. Let's put it that way. And like even the -X effects. So there are answers to this card. But it's kind of nice. It can block and attack very well, which is important for its second ability. And it deals combat damage to a player. You exile the top X cards of your library, where X is the amount of damage dealt. You can cast any number of the spells with mana value X or less from among them without paying their mana costs. So that's a pretty powerful line of text when you can cast something for free. This has to get in and deal damage. So it really wants, I was thinking like Audacity would be kind of sweet on it to give it more power and trample. So like pumping it, I think, and giving it trample so that it can get in and exile more cards, cast more cards for free. Could be a sweet combination. It also is a zombie, and Death Baron. We do have Death Baron now for foundations. That gives all zombies +1/+1 and Death Touch. Death Touch is nice too because it's kind of like evasion. They probably don't want to block it, but could be interesting to play this. I don't know if there's a sort of a zombie deck that could be legal, but something to consider. Overall, I think this card is probably a bit too slow. 4 mana is quite a bit, and it is very powerful if you get in and hit. But the fact that there's so much bounce and like exile effects, and just by itself, it does need some help. Like they could just chump block it, and that you know wouldn't be great. Or they could just block it with a 3/3 essentially. It does need some help, but the things that it does are pretty powerful. So I'll think about this one a little bit more too and see if there's any other interesting synergies here. But I think the main thing you want to do is just like pump it, give it trample. All right, next up we've got the Frostcliff Siege. Did I skip one? No, okay. The Frostcliff Siege, which is 3 mana for an enchantment, um, and blue and red enchantment. And you can choose Jeskai or Temur. If you choose Jeskai, whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, draw a card. So it's kind of nice card draw. But the Temur effect, I think I'm more excited about. Creatures you control get initial power and have trample and haste. So I feel like that's more powerful than the first one. Giving all your creatures trample and haste and additional power And you could play this, say, on turn 2 with like a Land War Elves if you were in Temur colors. And then say follow that up on turn 3 with like Anzarag attack for like 9 with trample and haste. That'd be kind of sweet, pretty sweet with like Yargle and Wiltani giving that trample and haste and additional power. Something like that I think could be pretty fun to try to build around. I don't know. I mean, these seem a little kind of janky, obviously, but definitely an interesting one to consider, I think. And the fact that you can choose either side, say if you drew an additional copy of it, you probably don't, the redundancy of trample and haste is kind of pointless, so you probably would choose the other side. So that's kind of cool and interesting. Yeah, so seems like a cool card. I'm gonna probably be brewing around this because it's got some jank combo potential for sure. But it seems like a fun one. So yeah, let me know if there's any other interesting synergies with this one that you can think of. Okay, next up we got our second Planeswalker, Elspeth the Stormslaver. Um, it is a 5 mana, 5 loyalty, and it says if one or more tokens would be created under your control, twice that many tokens are created instead. Powerful line of text. That's doubling season line of text there on a Planeswalker, which is pretty cool. +1 is to create a white soldier creature token. However, you're actually creating 2 because of its first line of text. 0 is to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Those creatures gain flying until end of turn. And -3, destroy target creature an opponent controls with mana value 3 or greater. So this card is, I think, pretty powerful. I mean, just as like a 5 mana like removal spell, not that great, but it does protect itself pretty well by making a bunch of soldiers and has a removal spell built into it. And it can kind of just like buff your whole team, give them all flying. So that's good. But yeah, like how do you take advantage of its static more? I mean, I was thinking like again, Urabrask Forge keeps coming to mind. Because it creates a token right away. You get 2 of those tokens right away, which is pretty powerful. Um, and then I don't know, seize the spoils, things that create treasure tokens, it doubles those, which is interesting. All sorts of tokens, it'll double those. But I think just like this card is on its own is pretty powerful. Just like a ton of value. It starts at 5, goes up to 6, right? So it's kind of hard to kill already. And making just like this token army pretty quickly, I think could certainly get out of control. So I think this card doesn't actually even need all that much help, or I think just the abilities within itself synergize well with it. You can pump all your creatures, give them flying. So could just be like a finisher in a removal, or sorry, in a control deck, something like that. But yeah, I don't know. 5 mana can be a bit expensive for a token deck. I mean, this could be see playing like green white tokens, things like that. But um, I don't know. Seems like a pretty versatile and just powerful standalone card on its own. Okay. Next up, we've got the Craterhoof Behemoth. This is a reprint, pretty cool one. Kind of happy. I kind of wanted this card to be in standard because of elf decks mostly, but there are other ways to cheat this into play. You can reanimate it and things like that. But elf, I think it works really well. Like when this sees play in other formats, it's usually because it's in an elf deck with Elvish Archdruid that or other elves that create a bunch of mana. And we actually do have Fierce Empath now. In standard from Foundations, which can search this up, so you can play like 1 or 2 copies of this in your deck, play the Empath, and just search it up and get additional mana from Empath being an elf, and having additional creature into play is relevant with the Behemoth. Um, so I think this card is sweet, and we'll see some play somewhere probably. Maybe not a tier 1 deck, but I don't know. I'm definitely just happy that this card is in standard, and there's interesting sort of ways to cheat it into play, or just cast it, I guess, with Elvish Archdruid and search it up. So, yeah, it's Craterhoof Behemoth. Can't complain. All right, next up we've got some more new stuff. Betor, Kin of All. This is a 5 mana 5/7 with flying, Spirit Dragon. So decent stats. I mean, pretty big on its own. At the beginning of your end step, if creatures you control have total toughness 10 or greater, draw a card. Then, if creatures you control have total toughness 20 or greater, untap each creature you control. Then, if creatures you control have total toughness 40 or greater, each opponent loses half their life rounded up. So definitely an interesting card, and the toughness matters cards. And there are some decent enablers actually in standard for this card. The Armored Armadillo, like if you just had those 2 cards, you'd be drawing a card every end step. That's pretty decent. And then, Bedrock Tortoise and Pride of the Hulklade. can definitely contribute to the amount of toughness that you have in play. So you could get to the point where you're just untapping all your creatures. I don't know how useful that actually is. Um, there are other cards that do that already, but if you have some mana dorks or things with tap abilities that could be useful. There are like a bunch of walls that have that effect too. Now I'm just kind of brewing in my head as I'm looking at this card. I'm like, oh, maybe I make a wall deck with this. There are a bunch of walls with like tap effects that do stuff. That probably wouldn't be very good, but could be interesting. And then the last line of text synergizes with Bloodletter of Alcazaz. So you have 40 toughness. Each opponent loses half their life rounded up. So losing half their life and then doubling that with Bloodletter is an instant win. There are obviously other effects that work with Bloodletter that do the same thing, but could be interesting to kind of have both of those cards in the same deck to kind of have an instant win if you get up to 40 toughness, which I don't know. I mean, I feel like that could be possible with like Pride, especially Pride gives you 15 of that 40, and this card itself gives you 7 of it. So, maybe there's something there. Let's jam all these cards in the same deck and see what happens. Um, it's an interesting card. It might just be more of a sort of commander card. I'm not really sure. But definitely some jank fun to brew around here. Okay. Next up, we got the All Out Assault. This card's interesting. 5 mana for an enchantment. Creatures you control get +1/+1, have Death Touch. And when it enters, if it's your main phase, there's an additional combat phase after this phase, followed by an additional main phase. Um, and when you next attack this turn, untap each creature you control. So basically, you get to attack twice when it comes into play, and it buffs your whole team, and it gives everything Death Touch, which makes them harder to block. So this card just seems like on its own, it seems pretty decent as like a top end to an aggressive deck. Getting additional combat steps and buffing your whole team is decent. There are cards already in standard that give additional combat steps that don't really see any play, but the fact that this gives you a buff and death touch, maybe it's worth it. In terms of its combo potential, though, I think there's some interesting things to consider. Like if you blink it, say with like scroll shift, you get an additional combat step, right? Or things like Calyx can create another copy of it, which can give you an additional combat step. Now, Calyx is kind of limited because as this last line of text, it says, do this only once each turn, sadly. But you could create additional combat or copies of All Out Assault, which would be kind of cool with Calyx. Or if somehow you like make it into a token and you copy it with Geared, that could give you additional combat steps and then untap the Geared. It could go some infinite combo there. If there's, an easy way to make a token copy of this card. So something to consider. Has some interesting combo potential, but maybe it's just kind of good enough as a top end too of an aggro deck. I don't know. Let me know what you think about this one. It seems kind of sweet to me. But I could also see it maybe never sees play because none of the additional combat phases cards have seen play thus far, really in standard. Okay, next up we've got the Rock Rock Rakshasha's bargain. Rakshasha's bargain. Okay, there we go. I did it. I think. Okay, you can pay. This is a hybrid mana. You can pay hybrid mana of colorless or black and colorless, 2 colorless or green, 2 colorless or blue. So you could pay 6 mana for this. You could pay 3 mana for this, or somewhere in between, depending on the colors in your deck. And it says, look at the top 4 cards of your library, put 2 of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. So some card selection, some card advantage. Kind of reminds me of Stock Up, which is a pretty good card and see some play now. You do need to pay this for 3 mana. You do need 3 specific colors, so it is definitely harder to cast. But the thing about this card is the casting cost is 6, which is interesting as a 3 drop because it triggers up the Beanstalk. There's some other hybrid cards that they revealed. None of them are, I think, as good as this one. But we'll see. Like that's kind of a dangerous territory with up the Beanstalk when you have too many things you can cast for cheap that actually cost more. That's just like a ton of card advantage and selection built in there. So that's kind of interesting. We'll see. This definitely just on its own, I feel like sets up your graveyard nicely, gives you card advantage. Is an instant as well, which is kind of advantage over stock up. You could also play it in, say, like a Trumpeted Carnosaur deck or like a Discover kind of deck, or Cascade kind of deck where you want to like make sure all your mana costs are specific. Uh, you know, costs, like with Trumpeting Carnosaur, you want to make sure they're 6 or more. So this could kind of help you, I don't know, find your Carnosaur, something like that. Um, so yeah, I could see this scene play in different areas, or just kind of by itself as a value card or graveyard setup card. So definitely interesting one. Something to kind of keep an eye on as an enabler for different strategies. Yeah, good one. Okay, next up we've got the Corroding Dragonstorm, which is a 2 mana enchantment. When it enters, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life, and then you surveil 2. And then also says when a dragon you control enters, return the enchantment to its owner's hand. So you could use this in say just like a pixie deck or a bounce deck, like a blue. There's blue cards that this town are big enough, things like that, that just bounce it back to your hand, right? But you can kind of already play this with if you're playing a dragon deck. This card seems kind of sweet because the dragons come into play. Also, just return it by itself, and then you play it again, get its effect again. I think this card is kind of an interesting enabler for a lot of different strategies. Actually, Surveillance 2 can set up your draws, can set up your graveyard. Having enchantment in play, again, you can bounce it, or there's other enchantment synergies in standard. Um, or you can kind of sacrifice it to bargain effects, things like that. So there's a lot. I think there's a lot of interesting uses for this card potentially. But I think the most exciting thing is that there is this line of dragon text. I think you would play this in a dragon deck, or I could see it being played in a dragon deck because being able to surveil and drain for 2 repeatedly is actually pretty powerful. So yeah, definitely interesting one to kind of keep an eye on as well. Okay, next up we got another big old dragon here. Definitely interesting one here too. This is 5 mana for a 6/6 flying lifelink, and it says spells you control have delve. So each card you exile from your graveyard while casting a spell costs 1 less. So if you fill up your graveyard, you can kind of get discounted on some of your cards, right? But it also says whenever you cast a spell, you lose life equal to its mana value. So that's not so good, right? um, so if you're casting something with that costs a lot, you're going to be losing a lot of life. Now this thing does have lifelink itself, so you can kind of make up for the life loss from the spells, um, which is interesting in that regard. But thinking like, would the CNA play? Is this any good? It kind of synergizes with Insidious Roots because having Delve is kind of sweet. You can, if you exile things from your graveyard, can trigger Insidious Roots. So maybe there's sort of like a combo there, or with the last ride, maybe you want to be losing life to get your life total down to a low amount, and then the last ride is active, or Death Shadow, things like that. Or maybe just playing like life gain spells. So like you're playing Union in a third path with Delve and making that really cheap, which then draws you cards, and then you gain the life back that you are losing. And so it doesn't really matter. You kind of go off from there. I mean, this just being a 5 mana 6/6 creature that dies to removal, a lot of removal. I can't really see it seeing play unless there's some really good combo that I'm missing with this. If it is interesting, you could play like artifacts and just exile stuff from your graveyard and play those right away when you play this. So maybe that's worth it. Like if you had 9 cards in your graveyard, you could play Portal to Phyrexia, but then you'd lose 9 life. I don't know. Seems interesting for sure. Another card I'm gonna have to think more about and see. But let me know in the comments below what you think about this one. Okay, next up, we've got the Temur Battlecrier, which is a 3 mana for 3 Orc Ranger. And it says during your turn, spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each creature you control with power 4 or greater. Interesting card. Again, this is giving you discounts on all your spells, but this costs a lot cheaper, and it can get additional discounts if you have more creatures with power 4 or greater. Also additional copies of itself. I think if you had 2 of these in play, um, would your spells cost 4 less? I don't know. I think so, right? Let me know in the comments below. But if you had like Tyrox, is like another 4 power creature, you could curve Tyrox into this and then play like a Prophetic Prison for free, and then keep kind of going through your deck again with this like 2 mana cantrip kind of things. That could be kind of interesting. I don't know if that's any good, but that's some sort of combo maybe. I feel like this card is got some cool combo potential for sure, and there's I think, a good amount of 4 power creatures itself. It also note that this discounts all spells, not just like creatures or non-creature spells. It says spells you cast cost 1 less. For each creature you control a power 4 greater. So that's a decent ability. If you're playing like a storm deck or something like that, and maybe there are some sort of like storm type cards in standard. I mean, well, there is a dragon that has storm, but I'm thinking of cards that generate some mana or generate some treasure tokens when they come into play, and there are some things like that. So you could think about maybe some combos there with this guy. Again, it does kind of die to a lot of removal, but it is cheap enough, I think, that this could see some interesting play in some combo deck, or maybe you're just discounting a 5-drop the next turn, and that's decent and good enough. So I don't know. Let me know in the comments below what you think about this one. Again, something to think about and consider all the different possibilities with, but I think it's got some potential for sure. Okay, next up is Ringing Strike Mastery. Excuse me, which is 1 mana for an aura. When it enters, tap enchanted creature. It doesn't untap, and 5 to untap that creature. The only reason I'm bringing this card up, well, I actually think it's kind of decent as a removal spell. It's not bad. It's just like a blue removal spell, but it could have some infinite combo potential if you can take advantage of the last ability, which is 5 to untap it. And you'd need a creature that taps for more than 5 mana to make this net an additional mana to untap when you untap it. We do have Redshift, which actually just came out. So if you played Redshift on 2 and then you pumped its power, there are ways to pump its power. 2 mana +4/+4 cards. So now it has 6 power. Play this and then go infinite from there. So there are some infinite combo potential with this card. So that's why I'm pointing it out. Probably pretty janky and not very good, but it's kind of cool that it's also kind of a removal spell too. That could be a combo card, but yeah, we'll see. Just some thoughts on that one. And let's see. Next up, I've got a collection of cards that I think are pretty sweet. That they spoiled today, but I couldn't think of any like blatant, like really good combos or synergies. I'll just let you know my thoughts on them. The Bloomvine Regent is another dragon for 5 mana, and it also has this Omen side. So it's 3 mana, search your library for up to 2 basic forest cards, reveal them, put one into the battlefield tapped and the other into your hand, and then shuffle. So it ramps you, gets you another forest. They have to be basic forests, unfortunately. They can't be like dual lands. Uh, so yeah. So maybe better in like a mono green deck, but you could play this in a 2-color deck as a ramp, but also could be decent in as like a finisher. I feel like either side of this card isn't particularly good. I mean, Cultivate is a decent card, right? And the right side just doesn't impress me that much. It does gain you 3 life, and then gains you some more life when a dragon comes into play. But I don't know. Green for 5 mana as a 4/5. Um, Green can usually do better. It is a flying green creature, so that is cool, right? Which you don't see all that often, but I don't know. I'm not too impressed by this one, but it is cool that it has again a dual half side to it, and you can ramp early or kind of have a payoff later. So I think there's that. Maelstrom of the Spirit Dragon. This one I think is decent. Really depending on your deck. You can tap for colorless, but also any color if you spend it to cast a dragon or omen spell. Again, like the omen on the left side here. You can use this to cast it. Also 4 mana to sacrifice it, search your library for a dragon card, put it in your hand, and then shuffle. So this again, we're gonna have to see which dragons we get. Um, but this could be a good card for a combo deck that wants to have a specific dragon in their hand or in play, or they're cheating out a specific dragon. So I don't know. I think this card could see some play. Is it good enough as like a mana fixer? You would need to have enough dragons in your deck to make this worth it. The downside of it being colorless. So I don't know. We'll see again. I think this one you kind of have to see when the whole set is revealed, because it really depends on the dragons and the omens in the set to really evaluate it well. But cool that it exists, and pretty awesome, amazing art, I would say, on that one. Okay, next up, we've got 3 more cards. Again, I think these are cool value cards, but I couldn't think of anything specifically like cool combos with them. So again, let me know in the comments below. Urani, the song, Unending. which is 8 mana for 10/10, flying protection from white and black. So pretty cool value. I mean, this could dominate the board. And when it enters, it deals X damage, divided to choose among any number of target creatures and or planeswalkers your opponents control, X the number of lands you control. So, if you had 8 lands out, this could like wipe your opponent's board. That's pretty powerful. I think this card's good. If you cheat it out or if you just cast it, definitely can, clean up your opponent's side of the board. It's hard to kill, which is really good. White and black are kind of the main removal spells that would be able to kill this. It can still get bounced by, this town ain't big enough, but then if you bounce it, you can maybe, I don't know, replay it again. So I don't know. The protection is very relevant, I would say, on this thing. And yeah, just seems like a good one. I don't know. I think it's a good reanimation target and a good value card. So I wouldn't be surprised to see some play. Again, Rediscover the Way, I think it's also pretty good card. Jeskai colors, 3 mana, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand and the rest in the bottom of your library in any order. So we're getting some value, some card draw, some card selection with this, some card advantage. And then chapter 3, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, target creature gains double strike until end of turn. So that can be quite powerful. This could be C play in like a prowess style deck. Jeskai is all about like the quick prowess kind of threats. So, you know, maybe you're playing 1 drop, 2 drop, play this, trigger all your prowess, and then get more cards to trigger prowess the next turns. And then on the following turn, give everything double strike, attack for the win. Could see that being decent. Seems okay. And then Anafenza here, 3 mana for a 2/2, Spirit Soldier, flash first strike, and then whenever another non-token creature you control dies, it endures 2. I can see this card being like quite the blowout in like limited. If your opponent attacks and you flash this in, maybe you take out one of their guys with the first strike, and then you trade off, but then you get a bunch of counters or extra 2/2s. So endures 2 is it puts either +2 counters on it or creates a 2/2 white spirit token. So could be good, maybe in standard. Yeah, it would be hard to see this being that great in standard. But if your opponent has like a heavy removal style deck, flashing this in response to one of the removal spells could get you some value there. But yeah, let me know what you think about these ones in the comments below. That was a ton of new cards to go over. Hope you enjoyed it. Yeah, I hope you're enjoying spoiler season. What are you thinking about for Tarkir Dragonstorm? Any cool brews that you're thinking about? Cool combos, synergies, things I missed? Love to hear it all in the comments below. Thanks so much for all your support for this channel, and probably be back tomorrow or the next day with some more spoilers, more combos, more synergies, interesting ideas for the set. It's looking pretty cool. Like overall, I'm much more excited about the set than I was for Aether Drift, I think. And I think there's some really cool build arounds and synergies and combos that I'm already seeing that are more powerful than Aether Drift. So hope you are enjoying it as well. Again, let me know in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video.